If you ask yourself, as the populists do, what the hell have you got to lose? Well, the answer is peace, security and stability, and that is a hell of a lot.
Hi everybody, Ian Bremmer here, and welcome back to your GZERO world. It's our first show for 2018, and boy, is there a lot to talk to you about. We'll start going to North Korea. Not really, but talking about, well, just about everything that's considered nuclear Armageddon. Then to Pakistan, where the Americans are cutting off aid, and a look at our top risks for the year ahead. I've got George Osborne, the former Chancellor of the United Kingdom and Editor-in-Chief of the London Evening Standard, talking about Brexit and things that go bump in the UK evening. I will also bring you your puppet regime. I'll talk to President Putin about Ukraine and some places a bit closer to home. But first, your world this week. To North Korea, where a few weeks ago we were talking about Armageddon. Today, we're still talking about Armageddon, but we're also talking about the North Koreans sending a delegation to the Olympics in South Korea. Who thought that was a good idea? Look, at the end of the day, part of this is because of Trump. He pushed the North Koreans hard with Chinese sanctions. Wouldn't have come if it was under Obama or under Bush. Part of this is bad. Trump's America First, North Korea policy is not a South Korea First policy, and the South Koreans recognize that that means they need to negotiate, even if Trump doesn't support it. What's interesting is Trump saying he didn't want negotiations. Once they're happening, he said, no, those negotiations were my idea, which means if there's an actual deal, he could take credit for it. There is some light at the end of the tunnel. The problem is that the North Koreans still want to show that they have a functional ICBM just in case Trump thinks he can actually take them out, which means after the Olympics are over, North Koreans are probably going to start testing again, and then we go back to thinking about Armageddon. But for now, let's have fun in South Korea. Next to another nuclear power that scares the crap out of us, Pakistan. Trump barely waited a few hours into the new year to send his first tweet, and it was about not Iran, not North Korea, but how Pakistan, we've wasted tens of billions of dollars, we need to cut off their aid. This after a year ago, he said Pakistan was awesome, he was going to go and visit. Well, look, he changed his mind about this stuff. The real point is that Pakistan has not been the most aligned non-NATO ally of the United States in recent years. They do provide safe haven for terrorists, and they do provide a lot of support for the Taliban, the Haqqani network. But they also have options. They do a lot more with China these days, and China spends a hell of a lot more money on Pakistan than the United States does, and that's before the U.S. cut off aid. That's where they're certainly going to be tilting. Also, the United States, with Secretary of Defense Mattis, has expanded troops in Afghanistan by some 6,000. Primary supply route through Pakistan. That's going to become a little more problematic over the coming months. And then I wanted to mention to you our top risks. Now, you may know that 20 years now, Eurasia Group, we write about where we think the world is heading in the coming year. The economics, of course, look fantastic right now. They've exceeded all expectations, and the American Dow soars through 25,000, yet another record. But we focus on politics, and the geopolitics, frankly, look unprecedentedly bad over that period of time. Our risk number one is China loves a vacuum. China's bigger than it was before. They've got consolidation of power under Xi Jinping, strongest leader they've had since Mao, and they have a real opportunity in responding to America First by Trump, which they know provides a lot of space for them to actually develop economic architecture, to spend money, and to get more countries politically hedging towards Beijing as opposed to Washington. Number two is accidents, mixed calculations. The fact that in a world that doesn't have a lot of leadership, doesn't have a lot of resilience, things like North Korea that I mentioned, the Iranian issue, a lot of countries that are operating in close proximity but don't talk or trust each other in Syria and over Syria, even things like cyber and terrorist attacks, the fact that when you respond to them, there's much less consolidation, that's much more fragmentation and divisiveness, that's a much bigger risk in 2018 than it has been. And one more to focus on. We actually do 10, but I'll give you a third. It's the erosion of institutions in the United States, in Europe. The free media, strong, consolidated, developed democracies feel less legitimate by their populations and are getting more eroded by leadership. In Europe, you've got 30% of political parties voted far left and far right. It was 7% just 10 years ago. In the UK, you've got Brexit. In the United States, you've got Trump. And all of this is actually making consolidated democracies a little less stable, a little more fragile, a little more vulnerable in 2018. You want to look at the rest? You can check out EurasiaGroup.net. But for now, you've got Puppet Regime. Okay, let me ask you a question or two about Ukraine.
My crane?
Your crane?
Well, certainly not your crane.
Well, not our crane. No, look, let's be serious for a second here. 3 years ago, you invaded a country, you shot down a civilian airliner, and you redrew the map of Europe. Now, today, no one cares, so how can...
Look, we saw a place with such lovely beaches, ethnic minority in need of help, neglected by federal government.
Vladimir, I'm talking about Crimea, not Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico, yo nunca dejaré de amarte.
Ay, que yo me voy para la tierra del gran petanceo.
Puerto Rico, yo nunca dejaré de amarte.
Ay, porque
Puppet Regime.
I'm just talking to George.
Work appropriate conversation.
Oh, did you step on my dog? I'm here in the West Village with George Osborne. He's editor-in-chief of the London Evening Standard, but also was Chancellor of the Exchequer for the United Kingdom. I'm delighted to be with him today.
Great to be here in your home, Ian.
How inextricably divided does the UK feel to you right now?
Well, I think there still remains quite a bitter division between many of the people who voted to leave and remain. It's still actually how British politics is characterised, how the factions in the different political parties, particularly the Conservative Party, are characterised. Now, hopefully with the passage of time that will abate. That's the case at the moment. I think it's an interesting question. Obviously, there are lots of parallels with what happened with Donald Trump and other movements around the world. And indeed, of course, people like President Trump self-identify with the Brexit movement, sometimes the discomfort of the Brexiteers. But if you were a historian, I don't think you would have a huge amount of trouble understanding what's going on at the moment. We've had a big economic shock, the financial crash a decade ago, stagnant real incomes, a big drop in GDP. That kind of thing in our modern history has always had a big spillover into politics and created anger and discontent, understandably. And at the same time, coincidentally, you've had this big technology shift where, just like the invention of the printing press or the television, you've got new social media, like the way people are watching this interview, and that has dramatically lowered the barriers to entry and shook up the existing political order, just like it's shaken up the newspaper industry or the music industry or whatever. So, those two things coming together has created populist movements that can emerge very quickly out of nowhere with relatively few resources and generate large followings because they're playing into a world, certainly in the West, which feels let down or angry.
What do you think represents the best hope for the UK being a little less divided going forward?
Well, I think the longer we look at the situation, the more people are coming to the realization that to depart radically from all of our major arrangements with our neighbours is a mistake. And the current conversation is, okay, well, we get to the spring of 2019 and we might leave the EU, but we're going to stay in some kind of transition arrangement, which is code for having all the sort of costs and obligations of EU membership and access rights for EU membership, just walking out of the room where those decisions about those arrangements are made. You might think, a very strange thing to do, but better than the alternatives. And that suggests to me that people are very nervous about going off a cliff edge, looking for this transition. And look, when you're in this transition, in my view, it could take quite a long time, because the simplest decision at any one point, and I've seen it in many European negotiations, will be just to sort of delay the transition. No one will delay the moment the transition comes to an end. No one will admit that now. You'll never get anyone from the British government saying that. You won't get anyone from the European Union saying that. But when push comes to shove, often the easiest thing to do if you can't get an agreement on something is to
kick it down the road.
Kick it down the road.
So who are the friends for the Brits in Europe right now? I mean, the Germans clearly have their own challenging elections to finish up, create this actual coalition. Merkel is weaker, Schäuble is gone. France is, focusing on far greater integration, something that very few people have appetite for. The Brexit is not the top priority for anybody else right now, right? So is kicking it down the road essentially ad infinitum the best the UK can hope for?
We've been having this conversation at your home last year. I think there have been a lot of concern in Europe that Brexit would herald the breakup of the EU. Indeed, that was one of the claims that some of the Brexiteers made. That has not been the case. If anything, it's solidified our neighbours and allies in the EU. And the big development in the EU has been the election of a French president, Emmanuel Macron, who's got a plan, in rather sort of classic French style, a grand projet, which is the further integration of the Eurozone. And even if he only gets 30 or 40% of it, because of German reluctance and the general problem of getting things agreed in the EU, that would be a major step forward. And what he has done, and I am quite a fan of what he's done in France.
And you spent a lot of time with him personally when he was Minister of Economy, and you were.
He was the Minister of Industry, and he was previously the economic advisor to François Hollande, and I had many meetings and meals and the like with him. He's a guy. He's a smart guy, but he's got a plan, and plan beats no plan, to use the phrase. And the EU didn't really have a plan, and now it does.
So Europe with a French plan, even if only quarter-baked, should be more attractive for the UK to be engaged with, no?
Britain was not in the Eurozone, so it never had to go along with this further integration. There was an intriguing reference in Emmanuel Macron's speech recently in France where he did touch on Britain, and he said maybe, if Europe reforms, there'll be a place for Britain in that reformed arrangement. Now, I think it'll be very difficult for Britain to either remain in the EU or, having left the EU, rejoin it. Yeah. But there are all sorts of countries who aren't in the EU, like Norway and Switzerland, much smaller countries than Britain, but nevertheless important countries. They have found working arrangements, bespoke arrangements with the EU, where they are able to participate in quite a lot of the EU's economic networks, for example. And, I can imagine, although this is heresy in the sort of Brexiteer camp at the moment, that in 4, 5, 10 years' time, we find ourselves in something like the Norwegian or the Swiss arrangement. In my view, not as good as what we got now, because it lacks the influence and means we're not in the room, but better than the alternative, which is to have, essentially no closer relationship with France 20 miles away from us than we might have with, India or Brazil or some country on the other side of the world.
So betting man right now, if you had to put odds on the likelihood you think that the UK ends up with no deal whatsoever, it'd be roughly what?
20%.
20%. Okay.
Some very smart people I know who say actually it's better than 50-50. Yeah. I don't think so, because I think in the end Britain would blink. With no deal, it means really basic things like your aviation agreements that allow planes to take off, your mobile phone agreements that allow data to be shared, your financial service, they all fall. So it's not a question of just sort of having some tariffs at the border, it's your regulatory arrangements don't work. And Britain would blink, I think, long before we got to that situation. As it happens, I think the EU also would blink. Ireland is an important member state, would be very damaged in a no-deal situation. Places like Antwerp and Rotterdam would be badly affected. But the impact on the overall EU would be considerably less, so I think they would blink after we would.
More likely to blink if Theresa May is still Premier or someone else?
Well, she is, frankly, after the election, less relevant to the conversation going forward because people know she's going to leave. And the real action in the Conservative Party is amongst people who are positioning themselves to take over from her.
It used to be when the Brits and the Americans got together, we talked about a special relationship. Haven't heard the term come out once with the Trump administration. Certainly feels a lot less relevant when you think about the global order today. Is there something still of a US-UK relationship that's actually special in your view?
Yeah, look, I still think it's a very close and important alliance. And, when the US takes action, its most reliable partner is the United Kingdom. Doesn't mean the United Kingdom always signs up to some kind of action with the US, but normally does, and I saw that when I was in the British National Security Council. I mean, one of the kind of challenges, I think, is when you're looking at the US-UK relationship is to sort of aim off for the characters at the top. I know that's difficult to do, and everything gets personalised through, the Prime Minister and the President holding hands and all that kind of thing. But of course, the relationship between our countries is deep, long-lasting, rooted in history, and exists at many levels, not just of the government, but of families and businesses and charities and the media and so on. And, that's where the strength lies.
Let me ask you about Russia, because of course it keeps coming out that the Russians played a significant role, not just in the US election, but actually in the Brexit referendum. How aware were you of that when you were part of the government, and what do you think the response needs to be?
Well, I wasn't aware at all, was the short answer to your question.
Did you?
I don't think, well, look, I think as with the US election, and I'm not a participant in US politics, personally, I think the whole Russian role in all of this has been a bit overblown. They're definitely out to cause trouble and disrupt things. And
they are not the Chinese force for stability.
They're a country that actually likes disorder on their border, which is quite unusual. Most countries look for order on their border. But, do I think it was the Russians that got Donald Trump elected? No. Do I think it's the Russians that caused Brexit? No, I don't. We should be robust about some of their actions. We should confront their espionage and political disruption. We should, as we do with the NATO mission in Eastern Europe, be absolutely clear that you can't cross international borders, and that's a red line. But that does not mean you put them in the deep freeze. You've got to try and find a way to get them round the table, because a problem like Syria is never going to be solved unless there's a Russian participant in that discussion.
So I want to go back to this quaint notion you had of shared values.
Quaint, that's a good English word.
UK. It is a good English word. I mean, you and I have a lot in common, sure, culturally, but, I mean, do our countries really?
There are shared values around individual freedom, free markets, an international trading system, resolution of disputes between neighbours in a friendly way rather than a hostile way, and that kind of thing. And I think there was a great shared effort led by the United States, but supported by the UK, to create, after the Second World War, a set of alliances and arrangements, NATO, the European Union, and all of those sorts of arrangements. And you can either sort of give up and say, okay, well, let's allow our countries to be atomized and divided and whatever, and let's, go along with the populist argument or the fringe argument that we should tear up all these arrangements, or we need to stand and fight for them. And if you ask yourself, as the populists do, what the hell have you got to lose to these populations? Well, the answer is peace, security, and stability, and that is a hell of a lot. And so it is worth fighting for. And if anything, I just think we've, and of course I'm as guilty of this as anyone, having been in a leadership role in the UK, I think we've sort of let the argument go. Let's take immigration, right? I am someone who believes immigration has brought enormous benefits to my country, to its economy, to its diversity, to its cultural output.
And that argument is largely lost.
And, we haven't really bothered to make that argument.
George, did you not do that because you thought it was self-evident, or did you not do it because you knew it was unpopular and it isn't what you wanted to play for?
On immigration, I think myself and collectively, the government I was part of, did not go out of its way to confront the views of those who essentially were saying immigration was a bad thing.
I was with Bush Jr. the other day, and he was talking about immigration, and he came across as abundantly sensible, bipartisan, wanting solutions. Of course, he's not in politics anymore. And so I guess I'm just asking you personally, because I know you, how aware were you of how politically constrained you were on some of these big issues?
I mean, the short answer is, I was always trying to fight for the values that I held dear. And broadly speaking, I think they advanced on my watch. But obviously it ended with us losing a European referendum, which, I was always uncomfortable with us holding, and then very disappointed that we lost. What I've decided is, rather than just sort of pack up and go home and forget about it, I'm editing a newspaper. I'm speaking to you and in public. I'm not saying it's the freedom I chose, but it's the freedom I've got. And, I'm enjoying it because I think it does enable you, with a bit of perspective, to make arguments that, I didn't make when I was in office.
George Osborne, very good to have you.
Thank you.
See you soon, my friend.
That's it for your show this week. Come back next week. I've got Preet Bharara. He's the former U.S. attorney fired by President Trump. Going to talk about the Mueller investigation and lots more.